He stood on the hillside while the wind moved through olive branches, and the crowd leaned in as if every syllable might be the hinge of their lives. Imagine that scene. A narrow path cut into Galilean earth, voices mingling with the distant lapping of the sea, sandals shifting on warm stone. The teacher's words began not with predictions of cosmic clocks or timetables, but with a strange upside-down catalogue of virtues: the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger for righteousness. Matthew records it, the Beatitudes, Matthew 5:3-12. That list uttered in the sun and dust was not a consolation prize for the weak. It was a blueprint. Now hold that image beside the modern phrase, the end times, beside the thunder of headlines and the pulsing curiosity that makes people search for signs. What if the real apocalypse, the true revelation that the word apocalypse originally implies, is less about calendars and more about exposure? What if the last things are primarily a test of foundations, and what Jesus taught on that hillside is the measuring rod? This is the thesis that will guide us. The Sermon on the Mount is not a decorative addendum to eschatology. It is the interpretive key. My claim, an interpretation rooted in the text, is that end times prophecies, properly understood, judge not only events but character. They reveal what our lives were built upon. Listen to the opening. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Matthew 5:3. To be poor in spirit is not simply to be helpless or defeated. It is an inner posture of dependence. It is the person who recognizes their spiritual bankruptcy and turns toward God's sufficiency. In a moment of crisis, when institutions groan, resources grow scarce, allegiances fray, those who are poor in spirit are not flummoxed by the collapse of self-reliance. Their default is not panic, but petition. They have practiced humility before they needed it. Blessed are those who mourn, Matthew 5:4. Mourning teaches stakes. It is the disciplined heart that grieves over brokenness, injustice, in relationships, in creation, and moves toward repair. In an apocalyptic moment, mourning is not sentimental sorrow. It becomes the engine of restoration. It provides moral clarity. We do not celebrate the fall of others. We work to restore those who are lost. The meek, Matthew 5:5, will inherit the earth. Meekness here is not timidity. It is strength under control, a refusal to assert power for domination. In the pressure cooker of social breakdown, those who know strength without domination resist the temptation to exploit chaos for personal gain. They practice restraint and steward power toward healing, not harm. This hunger and thirst for righteousness, Matthew 5:6, is crucial. Hunger for righteousness is not merely moralism. It is an active, restless pursuit of God's justice and mercy. It is the relentless refusal to accept evil as normal. In the face of apocalyptic pressures, hunger for righteousness becomes the engine of community resilience. People who will stand for the vulnerable, redistribute scarce resources, and refuse to allow fear to be weaponized. Blessed are the merciful, Matthew 5:7. Mercy, not mere sentiment, is the practice of withholding deserved vengeance and extending practical help. When systems collapse, retribution multiplies quickly. Mercy is the social lubricant that prevents violence from becoming the currency of survival. Those who have rehearsed mercy are better prepared to hold communities together. Pure in heart, Matthew 5:8, are those whose motives are transparent to God. Purity of heart is simplicity, integrity that refuses hypocrisy. In a season where the facade of faith can be stripped away, a pure heart will still seek God, not acclaim. Peacemakers, Matthew 5:9, will be called sons of God. The presence of peacemakers in a collapsing world is decisive. They are not passive. They are architects of reconciliation. They know how to listen, to negotiate, to hold contradictory grief without needing to win. Finally, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, Matthew 5:10-12, are promised a place in the kingdom. Jesus affirms that following the kingdom ethic will bring opposition, but it also secures ultimate vindication. Read together. The Beatitudes create a portrait of the human character that survives the severe testing of history. This is not a promise about comfort and prosperity. It is a preparation for endurance. If this is interpretation, then the startling implication is clear. Apocalypse exposes where we have invested our hearts. Consider a modern, non-sensational example. A small town faces sudden economic collapse when the primary factory closes. What kind of neighbors rise? Those who mourn set up food rotations for grieving families. The meek refuse to exploit the situation by buying property at fire sale prices. The merciful open spare rooms to displaced workers. The peacemakers prevent disputes from escalating into violence. Those who are poor in spirit pray and organize rather than resort to panic. This is not a miraculous invisibility from hardship. It is the outworking of character. The apocalypse, in this sense, is not a spectacle that selects winners based on cleverness or access to secret knowledge. It is a reveal. It shows what kind of people we have become. If you are following this line of thought and it resonates, I want to invite you to stay with the material. If you want a careful, grounded unpacking of how Jesus' ethic equips us for the last days without sensationalism, subscribe now and keep listening. We'll walk the text with caution and courage. Now turn with me to Jesus' claim about the law. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them but to fulfill them. Matthew 5:17. The fulfillment that Jesus announces is not a dismissal of moral demands. It is their internalization. Where the law once oriented action outwardly, do this, do not do that, Jesus reorients the law toward the inner landscape. The heart matters. That reorientation is the hinge of Jesus' ethical teaching. When he says, "You have heard that it was said, but I tell you," Matthew 5:21-48, he is undoing the safety of mere compliance. Consider anger. Scripture warns against murder. Jesus targets the garden of the Spirit where murder begins. The contempt, the unchecked rage, the dehumanizing gossip. Matthew 5:21-26. In a collapsing world, outward structures can be weapons or scaffolding. When structures fail, unexamined anger turns neighbor into enemy quickly. The apocalypse reveals raw hearts. The person who has not learned to be reconciled with a brother or sister before structural pressure will find themselves swallowed by destructive relationships. Thus, inner reconciliation is not merely pious. It is a survival skill for communities under strain. On lust, Jesus reframes the command against adultery as a call to the imagination. The glance that objectifies another is the early harvest of moral collapse. Matthew 5:27-30. He uses stark image, better to remove the thing that leads to ruin. Language that has to be read as hyperbolic boundary setting, not a call to self-mutilation. The point: decisive measures are required to cut off patterns that draw us away from life. In interpretive terms, the apocalypse will not be won by those who only talk about holiness. It will be navigated by those who have rearranged their lives, who have practiced boundaries, who have set up margins so they do not snap under pressure. Then Jesus says something harder still. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:43-48. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive survival trait. When communities crumble, the instinct for reciprocal violence is immediate. But Jesus' command undermines that instinct. Loving enemies is not naive pacifism. It is a strategy, not merely ethical but pragmatic, for preserving the moral fabric of community. When love is extended toward an enemy, it creates options for reconciliation and breaks cycles of revenge that otherwise escalate into permanent feuds. This is not to minimize the cost. Loving an enemy may expose you to risk. But Jesus' calculation is that in the long arc of community, mercy yields a more sustainable order than retaliation. These teachings reframe power. The sermon envisions a countercultural polity where weakness becomes strength and mercy outlasts coercion. That inversion is a key hermeneutical tool for reading end times material. Prophetic images of upheaval are not neutral, they are diagnostic. They reveal loyalties, expose idols, and make visible the foundations we had assumed were hidden. Pause for a moment and see how this plays out in everyday life. A church facing persecution in a hostile environment must decide how to respond. Do they seek protection through alliances that compromise the integrity of their witness? Or do they model the mercy and non-retaliation Jesus taught? The choice reveals foundations. The community built on reputation and power collapses when those supports vanish. The community built on dependence, humility, and sacrificial love endures. Move then to the next cluster, worry and treasures, Matthew 6. Jesus asks, "Are you not of more value than they?" Matthew 6:26. Birds do not sow or reap, yet the Father feeds them. The lilies do not toil, yet they are clothed. From these observations, Jesus draws a shocking conclusion for human anxiety. Trust in providence should govern priorities. Do not worry about your life, but seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Matthew 6:25-33. Here is the practical pivot. Preparation for trial is not hoarding born of fear. It is ordering the heart toward the kingdom. This is a radical recalibration of what it means to prepare. Preparing for the end is not identical to stockpiling, though prudence has a place. The core preparation Jesus emphasizes is spiritual orientation. Where does your mind settle when resources are uncertain? Do you default to panic-driven accumulation, or do you practice a trust that shapes decisions, giving generously, sharing resources early, investing in relationships that outlast scarcity? Jesus continues in Matthew 6:19-21. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Again, not a prescription against material responsibility, but an indictment of the heart's attachment. Treasures on earth are vulnerable to decay, theft, and shift. Treasures in heaven, character, acts of mercy, faithfulness, are not immune to hardship, but their value does not evaporate when institutions fail. When the lights go out and markets tumble, what you invested in character and service will be what the community remembers and needs. At the center of Matthew 6 sits the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:9-13, a liturgy that rearranges daily life. Give us this day our daily bread is not just supplication, it is daily dependence. The prayer trains the imagination to an economy where forgiveness is non-negotiable. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors, and where rescue from temptation is a repeated petition. The Lord's Prayer, interpreted as instruction, is a discipline. It shapes the rhythms of a community that will be tested by scarcity and temptation. In a season of pressure, those who have practiced this daily orientation will instinctively turn toward dependence and reconciliation, not panic and hoarding. If this seems too interior to be useful for an apocalypse conversation, remember that public order depends on private habits cultivated over time. The collective responses to catastrophe are the sum of individual souls. If those souls have practiced prayerful dependence and communal forgiveness, their communities will respond with less cruelty, more generosity, and a higher propensity to survive with integrity. Now consider Jesus' startling language about radical measures. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. Matthew 5:29. Read plainly, it is shocking, but the interpretive key, one that honors the text and avoids grotesque literalism, is to see this as rhetorical hyperbole. Jesus is forcing us to face our attachments. The image demands decisive action against whatever repeatedly drags us into ruin. It is not a literal endorsement of self-harm. It is a clarion call to ruthless boundary setting. Boundary setting is not fashionable in an era that prizes accommodation. Yet boundaries are crucial in crises. When a community has members whose addictions lead to theft, violence, or exploitation, the community must act, removing enabling conditions, providing rehabilitation, and protecting the vulnerable. The eye or hand that causes sin becomes a metaphor for those practices and relationships that, if left unchecked, will hollow out resilience. The apocalypse will not be cured by polite acquiescence to destructive patterns. It will be survived by those who choose the hard discipline of cut and commitment. This discipline extends into corporate life as well. Filthy money in the building's foundation will sink it sooner or later. If a congregation or institution tolerates corruption for influence, The stress of trial will eventually expose that corruption, and what was tolerated will destroy. The sermon warns against such compromise repeatedly. Outward religiosity that shelters debts of the soul will not suffice when storms come. The measure is inward. As we move toward the image that will become central, the house built on rock versus sand, hear the crescendo in Jesus' pedagogy. He binds doctrine to demeanor, law to longing. He moves from poetic paradoxes to practical imperatives. Forgive, pray, cut off sin, seek the kingdom, love enemies. Each beat of the sermon sharpens the hermeneutical lens for reading apocalyptic images. If the apocalyptic moment is a stress test, then these behaviors become diagnostics. When pressure is applied, what cracks? Where does the community leak its life? Let me make transparent a move of interpretation here. I am arguing that the apocalypse, as a theological category, primarily reveals what our foundations are. That is my reading of Jesus' priorities on the Mount, and I am anchoring it in the text. Other biblical prophetic passages, when invoked, should be read through this same ethical filter. Prophetic visions alarm, not to instruct us in dates, but to call us to repentance and to expose foundations. This is not to say prophetic literature has no content about events. It does. But the sermon insists that the central concern of God is the transformation of the human heart and the communal patterns that built upon it. This interpretive posture calls for a different form of preparation, character formation rather than checklist completion. The question becomes, in the face of final revelation, whether that revelation is sudden calamity or the slow unveiling of truth, what kinds of people will endure and be agents of restoration? The Beatitudes sketch those kinds of people. The deeper law shows how to cultivate them. The Lord's Prayer trains daily dependence. Radical holiness demands decisive detachment from sin. The two foundations will test those investments. Before we arrive at that testing image, let us pause in the ethical middle ground Jesus carved out. He is not offering a private spirituality irrelevant to social and political realities. He is forming a people whose habits transform the public square. The sermon's ethics do not counsel withdrawal. They call engagement under a different logic. This logic shapes leadership: humility over domination, mercy over retribution, trust over anxiety, radical, not reactionary, holiness. Imagine a city under prolonged strain, resources scarce, institutions unreliable. The narrative often imagined in apocalyptic fiction is one of chaos and moral dissent. But Jesus invites another imagination, a city where people hunger for righteousness, where peacemakers weave networks of mutual aid, where forgiveness breaks cycles of violence, where prayers for daily bread are matched by acts of communal sharing, where leaders cut off practices that encourage predation. This alternative is not utopian naivete. It is the outworking of training, a way of living that resists the slide into tribalism. Now, as we edge into the parable of the houses, Jesus tells two stories that compress the sermon into an image. One man builds his house on rock, another builds on sand. Rain falls, floods come, winds blow. The house on the rock stands, the house on the sand collapses. Matthew 7:24-27. This is the image that will carry us into the heart of the apocalyptic thesis. The storm is the reveal. But before we fully enter the storm, the sermon leaves us with an unsettling question. On what have you built your life? At this junction, we must resist the temptation to translate rock into a private doctrine or a program of spiritual consumption. The rock is not a theological commodity. It is the ethics Jesus has outlined. The rock is the practice of mercy, of hunger for righteousness, of radical internal reformation. The sand is the brittle accumulation of wealth, reputation, or power that cannot bear the weight of testing. When crises unmask our foundations, the sand is scattered. Pause with that image and imagine its implications. The storm in the parable functions as an archetype for any cataclysmic pressure: natural disaster, social breakdown, political upheaval, internal collapse. And in a theological frame, it can extend to the eschatological unveiling the prophets spoke about. The apocalypse, therefore, is not only an event to be predicted, but a court in which foundations are tried. That trial reveals not merely what happens in the world, but what resides in the hearts of people. This theological pivot, that apocalypse judges foundations, has immediate pastoral ramifications. It changes how we preach, how we prepare, how we lead. Sermons become not just vehicles of information about possible future events, but formation practices aimed at shaping those virtues that endure. Preparation ministries become not only emergency responses, but apprenticeship in mercy and trust. Public witness becomes a laboratory for practicing forgiveness and peacemaking under small pressures, so that when large pressures arrive, the habit is established. At this point, the narrative is gathering momentum. We have traced the Beatitudes as a portrait of the survivor, the inward fulfillment of the law as the means of formation, enemy love as a strategic ethic, trust and treasures as reorientation of priorities, the Lord's Prayer as daily training, radical holiness as necessary boundary work, and finally, the two foundations as the parable that reframes apocalypse as a test. Each of these textual beats amplifies the same thesis. The end times, whatever shape they take, reveal what we are made of. Yet a tension remains. If the apocalypse is primarily a test of character, how do prophetic visions that depict cosmic violence or astonishing images fit in? The answer, in careful biblical interpretation, is that prophetic imagery often functions rhetorically. It is designed to wake up a people. The terrifying images are not primarily descriptive timetables for calculating the future. They are summonses to moral reformation. When Revelation shows plagues and thrones and cosmic judgment, it does prophetic work that accelerates urgency, but it also calls the church toward a holy, merciful life. Reading prophetic texts through the Sermon on the Mount does not neutralize their force. It reshapes it. It insists that what matters most in the face of prophecy is the cultivation of character, not the accumulation of information about when events will occur. This interpretive restraint does not make the prophetic less dramatic. It makes it more demanding. If a prophetic warning is real, then the ethical requirement intensifies. There is no comfort in speculation. There is work to be done. Character formation accelerates. We must also name another danger: the temptation to weaponize apocalypse as a lever for power. History is full of movements that have cited end-times language to justify ruthless actions. The sermon is a corrective. It refuses a God who delights in destruction. It refuses a piety that counts enemies as disposable. The ethics of the Mount dismantle any theology that would exploit prophetic fear for self-aggrandizement. As we prepare to move deeper into the imagery of the storm and the final test of foundations, take stock. The sermon has given us a moral map. The challenge now is to translate that map into concrete practices that can be lived out in ordinary days, so that when extraordinary days come, the pattern is already in place. This translation is neither simple nor sentimental. It requires discipline, daily prayer that reorders priorities, relentless forgiveness that rebuilds trust, decisive boundary setting that protects the vulnerable, and a hunger for righteousness that refuses to settle for easy compromise. There is urgency in that demand. Not the panic of the sensationalist, but the sober alarm of a physician diagnosing a grave illness and prescribing treatment. If the heart of apocalypse is the exposure of foundations, then formation is our prescription. We return again and again to Jesus' words, because they are the curriculum by which believers are shaped to embody the kingdom when life peels back its layers. And so the story moves toward its most vivid image. On the Mount, the crowd has heard these teachings. Some are eager, some confused, some affronted. The teacher now compresses his instruction into a final parable about houses and storms. It is here, the moment before the thunder, that we must confront a question that will be unavoidable in every life. In the face of final revelation, in the face of pressure that strips away pretense, what will hold you? The wind is rising. In the distance, the sea seems to darken. You can see the horizon blacken as if the weather itself were listening for the answer. The people on the hillside lean forward. Some will build with practical measures but shallow motives. Some will build with a theology that is sturdy in words but soft in conduct. Others will choose the hazardous apprenticeship of mercy and prayer. The reveal is near. And this is where we will pause for a moment. Not because the story ends, but because the next movement requires us to cross from exposition to decision. The storm will come, and when it does, the parable will answer, who stands? Who falls? But before unveiling that judgment, there is one more layer to the sermon's pedagogy that we must bring into focus. How daily practices form the architecture of a life that will either be shaken or will stand. In the next section, we will examine those practices in concrete terms. How to cultivate mercy in the small, how to enact boundary setting that both protects and redeems, how to reorient priorities so treasure shifts upward, and how to embody forgiveness in a way that becomes contagious rather than corrosive. Hold the hillside image in your mind, the dust, the olive trees, the crowd, and carry with it this mounting conviction. Apocalypse reveals. The sermon shows what to build on. The test is coming. The question of foundation is not theological trivia. It is the most urgent pastoral matter any of us will face. Hold that hillside in your imagination. The smell of dust, the rustle of olive leaves, faces turned toward a voice that refuses easy comforts, and imagine how the day-to-day habits of a person become the hidden scaffolding of a life. Small practices shape large outcomes. The sermon has already sketched the architecture. Now we must examine the bricks and mortar. How do you rehearse mercy in ordinary moments so it becomes a reflex in crisis? How do you practice boundary setting so it is available when everything threatens to pull you under? How do you reorder treasures so that when scarcity comes, your hands know how to give rather than clutch tighter? Begin with mercy in the small. Mercy is not primarily an emotion, it is a discipline. It is practiced when you refuse to speak the gossip that would wound a neighbor, when you give someone extra time at work because you remember your own fallibility, when you open your home to someone who would otherwise sleep outside. These are tiny, repeatable acts that build neural pathways of compassion. Jesus' teaching, "Blessed are the merciful," Matthew 5:7, is not a suggestion for special seasons. It is a regimen. In weeks and months and years of small mercies, a person becomes the sort of presence who can stabilize a crumbling community. When the headline moments come, mercy practiced daily becomes the only currency that buys trust across fractured lines. Coupled with mercy is the practice of reconciliation. Jesus insists on making peace before worship. Reconcile with your brother before presenting your offering. Matthew 5:23-24. This is a countercultural demand because it throws the burden of repair onto the offended as well as the offender. Reconciliation-trained communities create habits of repair, listening, bearing wrongs, naming harm, and restoring trust. When public order unravels, such communities already possess the skills to mediate disputes without defaulting to revenge. The apocalypse, then, will not find them unprepared in doctrine alone. It will find them fluent in repair. Now consider boundary setting, the kind of decisive removal of temptation Jesus describes with hyperbole. The eye plucked out, the hand cut off. Matthew 5:29-30. Read soberly. This is an ethic of prioritization. Remove from your life whatever most reliably drags you away from the life God calls you to. Practically, this looks like ending relationships that induce constant compromise, canceling subscriptions to media that stoke bitterness, closing accounts that facilitate dishonest gain, or stepping away from systems that train you to value status over service. The call is surgical, not cruel. It is to say no to things that repeatedly make you less than who God intends. But boundary setting is never merely an individual affair. It requires community structures of accountability and restoration. The church, functioning as a hospital rather than a courtroom, must create pathways for people to be held accountable and to be healed. That means disciplined practices, confession in trusted relationships, mentoring across age and experience, economic transparency where money is involved, and restorative processes that prioritize healing over punishment. These practices protect the vulnerable and make community resilient. In an apocalyptic pressure test, institutions that have done this work will resist collapse because their membership has practiced integrity and repair long before catastrophe. Next comes the daily reorientation of priorities Jesus proposes. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Matthew 6:33. This is a strategic instruction. When your axis is turned toward God's reign, your decisions about resources, time, and influence are calibrated differently. Practically, seeking the kingdom first will shape how you use money, how you vote with your feet and your wallet, and how you invest your time. It means training your household to give sacrificially, to open up stores of food as soon as a neighbor's need appears, to create mutual aid networks that are not emergency improvisations but practiced habits. Preparing in this way is not the same as hoarding. It is the formation of a generosity muscle. The Lord's Prayer stands at the heart of this daily orientation. Matthew 6:9-13. It is an embodied curriculum. Address God as Father. Pray for the extension of God's reign. Ask for daily provision. Seek forgiveness and the capacity to forgive. Plead for deliverance from the tempter. Practicing this prayer daily rewires the imagination. An ordinary hardship, missed paychecks, a broken relationship, the sting of betrayal. Those who have prayed these lines repeatedly find their impulses aligning with restoration rather than rage, with provision-seeking rather than panic. The Lord's Prayer trains the heart to expect God's economy to be active in hard times. There is also a practical intelligence in Jesus' words about where you store your treasure. If your primary investments are in what is transient, retirement accounts hoarded to the point of stinginess, reputational capital protected at all costs, political influence used to secure advantage, then the storm will expose the instability of those foundations. Conversely, those who invest in relationships, time with children and grandchildren, mentorships, sacrificial giving that establishes networks of mutual care, are storing up a treasury that functions as a social safety net when formal systems fail. The sermon does not outlaw prudent financial planning, but it does demand that such planning be measured by generosity and the capacity to release resources for others in need. Now heed the harder edges of the sermon, the call to radical holiness and the removal of impediments to life. Jesus uses stark language not to glorify suffering, but to underline the seriousness of sin's consequences. The point is not self-inflicted pain, but the elimination of recurring ruins. In pastoral practice, radical holiness takes shape in honest inventory. What sin patterns recur in your life? Where do your decisions habitually betray the kingdom? Radical holiness is a regimen of countermeasures, unplugging from forms of entertainment that numb conscience, restructuring schedules that prioritize busyness over relationship, entering into therapy for deep trauma that fuels destructive behaviors, or stepping out of leadership roles where pride corrodes. One of the sermon's most controversial demands is the willingness to make costly sacrifices to avoid the long-term devastation of sin. This is not asceticism as spiritual display. It is discipleship discipline. It may look like exiting an unfixable marriage after years of violent behavior, or it may look like dismantling a business model built on exploiting workers. It may cost reputation, resources, and comfort. Yet the sermon insists that the cost of inaction is far higher. A foundation undermined from within yields collapse later with greater ruin. This discipline must be matched with mercy. Radical holiness without restoration becomes cruelty. Mercy without holiness becomes permissiveness. The sermon weaves them together. Cut out the sin, then restore the sinner, protect the vulnerable, then invite the wrongdoer into a path of repentance. The apocalyptic test will expose whether communities have learned to hold both truth and love, administering discipline in ways that aim at healing and reintegration. As we tighten the focus, consider how these practices translate into public witness in moments of upheaval. Imagine the first hour after a citywide blackout. Stores are closed, tempers flare, rumors surge. The people who have practiced mercy, reconciliation, boundaries, prayer, and generosity will move differently. They will convene neighbors to coordinate food sharing. They will stop rumor by relaying verified information. They will protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. They will sit with frightened children rather than trumpet their own preparedness. Their life, practiced in small increments, becomes the public performance of the kingdom when the script of normalcy fails. Now return to the Mount's closing image, the two houses, and bring it into the full weight of the eschatological frame. The storm in Jesus' parable is not a single type of catastrophe. It is a symbol of revealing pressure. It can be an economic collapse, a pandemic, a moral unraveling, or the eventual cosmic unveiling the prophets depict. The essential fact is this: storms expose foundations. Those who have been formed by the sermon's disciplines have built on rock. Those who have relied on sand will discover their insecurity. Picture the storm with cinematic clarity. Clouds bank like a gathering jury. Wind shifts from casual to accusatory. Rain comes not as a drizzle, but as a weight that tests every seam and joint. The house on the sand shudders. Plaster cracks. Furniture floats away. Support beams buckle under the strain. The collapse is not merely structural. It is moral and relational. Hidden shortcuts, compromises, and loyalties betray themselves. Neighbors who once laughed together now quarrel over dwindling supplies. The place that seemed strong because of wealth or status betrays its builders when those things are gone. Now look to the house on the rock. Its builder had listened to the sermon. They had practiced mercy until it was reflexive. They had cut off what led to ruin. They had prayed daily. They had invested in relationships rather than only in goods. When the storm arrived, the house creaked and groaned but held. Rooflines stayed true. Windows wavered but did not shatter. In the immediate aftermath, that household becomes a point of refuge, not because they saved everything, but because their life had been arranged around practices that sustained others. The rock, in this reading, is not doctrinal assent, but incarnated behavior, the ethic of Jesus made habitual. This is the shocking truth promised at the outset. Apocalypse is less about predicting external events than about revealing internal realities. Prophecy and parable point to the same end. God's judgment unmasks foundations. The last days, therefore, do not primarily invite calculation of dates but cultivation of character. To call this a shocking truth is not to flirt with sensationalism. It is to insist that many expect the apocalypse to be an intellectual contest. Who read the right signs? When Jesus insists it will be a moral and practical trial. Who built rightly? That truth has pastoral consequences. It changes urgency from panic to formation. It means our response should be to double down on daily disciplines, not to chase every speculative headline. It means pastors and teachers must prioritize apprenticeship in mercy, confession, prayer, and courageous boundary work. It means congregations must practice mutual aid, not merely fund emergency stockpiles. It means our politics of faith must be defined by sacrificial presence, not by using fear to consolidate influence. And so we arrive at concrete, actionable steps, practices anyone can begin today that, when repeated, will begin to build a life on rock. These are neither magic formulas nor exhaustive prescriptions. They are spiritual disciplines tethered to biblical instruction and practical wisdom. First, cultivate a daily discipline of dependence. Pray the Lord's Prayer intentionally each morning. Make it not a rote recitation, but a framework. Acknowledge God's reign. Ask for daily provision. Practice forgiving others and receiving forgiveness, and petition for deliverance from temptation. Let this prayer shape your decisions for the day. The rhythm of this prayer trains dependence and shapes response under pressure. Second, rehearse mercy in tiny acts. Set a weekly practice of reaching out to one person who is marginalized or overlooked. Bring a meal, send a note, make a call. Regular acts of mercy rewire a community to care before crises intensify. Make generosity a habit, not an emergency response. Third, establish honest boundaries and accountability. Identify one recurrent temptation or relational pattern that undermines your life. Take concrete steps. Change passwords, Step away from a destructive friendship, enroll in counseling, or invite an accountability partner. Do this not shamefully, but strategically. Ask your community to help you remain faithful. Fourth, invest in relational treasuries. Prioritize face-to-face time with family, neighbors, and mentors. Create redundancy in your networks so that care does not rest on a single person or institution. Organize neighborhood teams for sharing skills and resources. These investments function as practical insurance when formal systems fail. Fifth, practice small-scale reconciliation regularly. Do not wait for grand gestures. Short, honest conversations that repair trust are the training ground for larger reconciliations. Commit to initiating at least one reconciliation conversation this month in a relationship marked by distance or hurt. Sixth, reorder financial plans by generosity. Audit your giving and ask, does my budget reflect kingdom priorities? Consider redirecting resources toward mutual aid funds that support the vulnerable in your community. Preparing financially for hardship should be done with open hands, not clenched fists. Seventh, teach and model peacemaking skills. Communities that weather storms do so because they have practiced listening, negotiation, and conflict de-escalation. Offer or attend training in restorative practices. Make peacemaking a mark of leadership in your congregation. All of these steps are doable and measurable. They require persistence, not perfection. They assume that formation takes time, and that fidelity is built through repeated ordinary acts. Before we close, let us briefly acknowledge the prophetic literature beyond Matthew. Some texts in the prophets and Revelation use dramatic imagery to awaken hearts. Interpreting them through the sermon's lens, as I have suggested, shifts emphasis from predicting timelines to testing character. That interpretive stance is not the only way to read prophetic texts, but it is a theologically faithful and pastorally responsible one. It guards against exploiting fear and prioritizes the spiritual formation that matters when revelation arrives. Call this an interpretation, one among many committed to keeping the heart of Jesus central. Finally, the moment of decision stands before you as surely as it stood before the hillside crowd. The choice is simple in description, though costly in practice. Build on the rock or the sand. To build on the rock is to begin now the labor of formation. Daily prayer, habitual mercy, courageous boundary setting, generous investment in relationships, and practiced peacemaking. It is to let the Lord's Prayer become your daily orientation, to make confession and reconciliation ordinary, and to order your life around giving rather than hoarding. It is to accept that following Jesus will provoke opposition at times, but also that this obedience places you within God's sustaining purposes. If this teaching has unsettled you, let the unease be the beginning of action. Do not let the fear that often accompanies thoughts of the end become a disabling terror. Instead, let it sharpen your focus. Choose today to reorient. Begin with one of the practices above and commit to it publicly. Tell a trusted friend, join a small group, sign up for accountability. Small beginnings can become steady foundations. The storm will come in some form, perhaps as a sudden upheaval, perhaps as a slow unraveling. And when it does, the true question will not be which conspiracy you read last or which sign you recognized. It will be what your life had become. Will you be a person of practiced mercy, steady prayer, courageous holiness, and peacemaking skill? Will your life be a refuge to others or merely a fortress for yourself? Choose the rock. Choose the hard daily work of formation. Build your house on the ethic Jesus taught, the life of humble dependence, relentless mercy, radical integrity, and faithful prayer. If this challenged you, share it with someone who keeps looking for signs instead of foundations. Commit with someone today to one of the practices I named, and let your life begin the patient work of building. If you found this teaching helpful, consider subscribing so we can continue to walk the text together, carefully, soberly, and courageously. Share this with a friend who is facing a storm. Build with them on the rock. The test will come, and the kingdom's endurance depends less on foreknowledge than on formation. Choose your foundation today.